Hello Nintendo, Wii here. This video is going to be a bit different to my other videos. This is more of an informative video. I just want to explain about Game Boy games. There's lots of different types. As I'm sure you're aware, some are black cases, some have grey cases, such as this one, and some have see-through cases, like these. I just want to explain a bit what these different colours mean. These grey ones, these work in any Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, and they're it says original game pack on them. That means that they were built for the original Game Boy. And if you take a look at a box for one of them, hold on 1 second. Here's a box for an original Game Boy game, and on the back it shows nothing but a description and some pictures. Compare that to the box of a Game Boy Color game, such as Zelda Oracle of Ages, and up the top on the back here, I'm not sure if you can see, it says Game Boy no, Game Boy Color yes, Game Boy Advance yes, and that tells you which machines you can play the game on. So these see-through games, such as Donkey Kong and Rayman there, these won't play on the original black and white Game Boy. These will. These ones with the black cases, these can work on either of them, the original Game Boy or the Game Boy Color. And if you play these black ones on the Game Boy Color, they have colour added to them. And some games, such as these ones don't have colour added to them if you're playing them on a Game Boy Color, but if you're playing them on the Super Game Boy, then they'll have either special backgrounds, added colour, or better sound effects and music. You can tell if these games work on the Super Game Boy, because it says Super Game Boy up there in the corner. The Super Game Boy is an add-on for the SNES. And as you can see, the background started to change into this specially designed Killer Instinct background. And the game's also in colour. This doesn't work for all the games. I'll show you what it's like if you put in an original Game Boy game. Let's pick Mega Man, for example. And turn that on there. And it just comes up as normal black and white. But on the Super Game Boy you have this option here where it lets you alter the colour scheme by using these. Now I'll just quickly mention the Pokemon games. I'll lay them out across here. As you can see, the Pokemon games come in all sorts of different colours. These just correspond to the colour of the Pokemon game, like that's Pokemon Yellow, so it's yellow, Pokemon Red, Pokemon Blue, etc. I'm not sure if you're aware of these, but there are such games that say on the side Game USA Advance, Colour Advance. Don't be fooled, these aren't Game Boy Advance games. These do work in the Game Boy Color. They're just a collection of different games. Here's one, normal Game Boy Color size, even though it says Game USA Advance on the side. That's just because they're fake, and yes. So if you do see any of these and you think they won't work in the Game Boy Color, they will. These ones though, that just say Game Boy Advance, these ones don't work in the Game Boy Color. And you can usually tell on the back, if the games are red, that means that they're Game Boy Advance games, and the black ones are NES games. Now, on the GameCube, there's also a similar thing to the Super Game Boy, called the Game Boy Player, that plugs into the bottom of the machine, which is over here. So you put your Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Color, or classic Game Boy game in there, and you put the disc that comes in there. I'll just put in Donkey Kong. And as you can see, these are only displayed in two colours, like you would see it being displayed on the Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Color. So it doesn't matter whether it says it's a Super Game Boy game or not, they won't play in full colour on the GameCube. Let's compare this to playing the same game on the SNES. As you can see, it puts it in colour. So even though this was an original grey Game Boy game, because it says Super Game Boy on it, it means that you can play it on the TV in colour, but it won't work playing through the GameCube. There's one type of game that won't work in the Super Game Boy, and that's the see-through Game Boy Color games. If you try and put one of them in, I'll show you what happens. And it goes to a screen that says the game's only designed for play in the Game Boy Color. If you play one of the black games that are in colour when played on a Game Boy Color, if you play them through the Super Game Boy, and they're not Super Game Boy compatible, then they'll just appear in the two colours and give you the Game Boy version of the game as opposed to the Colour Game Boy version of the game. But if I take this out and put it in the Game Boy Advance, there we go. It will show up as a colour game. So through playing it on the Game Boy Color, you have a lot more choices. It'll be impossible for me to play this with one hand, so I'm not even going to bother trying. If you try and play a Game Boy Color game in the original Game Boy, such as this one here, the machine won't actually switch on, because the switch to allow the machine to turn on there's a little bit there that it clips into, which on the original Game Boy games is this little flat bit here. Unlike the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Pocket doesn't have a hole for the switch to flick into. It just flicks back. So, if you try and play a Game Boy Color game in the Game Boy Pocket, it'll come up with the same screen it would on the SNES, and it says this game pack will only work with the Game Boy Color. There's another way to add colour to original Game Boy games, and that's using a Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Advance SP. So if you turn the Game Boy Advance on, and either hold left, right, up or down, then it will change the background colour. So for example, this will make everything green. I don't know if you can see this. And you can also press L and R to make the game widescreen or normal size. Now the Game Boy camera. This can be used in any version of the Game Boy except the Game Boy Micro. You can even use it in the Super Game Boy if you want. Turn it around so it's facing you. Switch it on. If you go and shoot, go to take a photo. There you go, you can see me there. Hello, I'm on SNES Vision. There's a controller I'm using there. So you can use it as a webcam if you want. It's not very good quality as you can see, but yeah, it's fairly good for the Game Boy. You can use it in the Game Boy player, but it's a bit more awkward. I'll hold one of them stickers up there, see if you can see that. Here's the view from the GameCube, and there's that sticker. You can see it's not very clear though. The view on the SNES is much clearer, and plus this tries to edit colour so it looks all green. You can make it widescreen by pressing L. The Game Boy printer can work with any type of Game Boy that either has a connector like that or a smaller link cable and connector like that, because on the end of the wire for the Game Boy printer it's got both types. So the only thing you can't use that with is a SNES, because on the Super Game Boy there's no extension slot. Now I've already told you that the SNES and the GameCube can play Game Boy games, but so can the N64, but only with certain games. For example, if you have Pokemon Stadium in the machine, then you can use this here, called the Transfer Pack, to play your Game Boy Pokemon games on the TV. Put it inside the Transfer Pack, like that. And the Transfer Pack, instead of going into the machine, goes into the back of the controller where the Rumble Pack or memory card goes. So you take that out, replace it with that, and then that sits on the back of the controller like a jetpack. and when you start up, it should say that you've got a Game Boy game inserted. It adds a bit of colour, as you can see, the water's blue. But like the SNES Game Boy player, it can only have two colours at a time, so the only Game Boy Advance that original Game Boy games don't work in is the Game Boy Micro, which isn't technically a Game Boy Advance. See, they don't click in at all, and if they did, it would look a bit silly, sticking out like that. So yes, if you have a Game Boy Micro, don't try and play Game Boy games because they won't work. Same applies for the DS and DS Lite. The original Game Boy games won't fit inside the Game Boy Advance slot. Thanks for watching. Hope you found that helpful and interesting. That's it. See you soon.